All right, welcome everybody. We're going to go and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people from all over the world, so that's gonna resonate for one of you. My name is Chantal Warner. I'm one of the two co-directors of CERCLL, together with my colleague Beatrice Dupuis, and with me here today are also Kate Paesani, our associate director, and Marisol Aguirre, our outreach coordinator. So we'll get started here with the main event in just a second, but first I have just a couple of things to tell you about CERCLL. For those of you who are attending one of our webinars, maybe for the first time or haven't encountered the LRCs, the language resource centers before, CERCLL, we're the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy. And we are a national language resource center that's housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. We're one of 16 though. And so if you are not familiar with us, please do visit our website. We have other professional development events, as well as a number of open educational resources and other things for language and culture educators. And also we encourage you to visit the joint site of the other national language resource centers, including CARLA, represented here today by our speaker, and to check out all of the different resources we have. We work a lot collaboratively and cover different kinds of area. So take a look at all the things that we have to offer. We do have an event upcoming that we wanted to highlight. This is the Second Language Multimodal Literacy Symposium. This will be a completely remote event, and our call for papers has a deadline of January 6th, so that's coming up soon, which is why we're highlighting it. But the event itself will be held in April 21st to 22nd. And so if you're interested in submitting something, perhaps you're working in this area, please do submit. And even if you're not, feel free to register. We'll have that registration opening up early in 2023. And we have a really exciting set of keynote speakers that are there for you as well. This is the first of our 2022-2023 webinar series, which will be focusing on Multiliteracies takes on language teaching. And so this will be the first of a few talks. And just so you have those dates in front of you, our next webinar will be December 10th. And that'll be hosted by or led by Amanda Schuffelberger, who'll be presenting on poetry and creative texts in any language classroom. And then in the spring, we're going to have 3 webinars that are continuing to explore the topics that we are kind of opening up today with Kate Paesani's talk, by focusing on different genres, different kinds of context, and different kind of aspects of this question of what does multiliteracies look like in the language and culture classroom. So with that, we're going to turn to today's main event, and it is my very, very great and genuine pleasure to be able to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Kate Paesani. Kate Paesani is the director of the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition, CARLA, and this is one of CERCLL's sister centers in that same LRC program that I mentioned before. She's also an associate professor in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Minnesota, and her research focuses on literacies-based curriculum and instruction and language teacher development. She's one of the most influential advocates and scholars in this area of multiliteracies pedagogy and second language and culture, and her work has been inspirational for scholars and educators working to integrate text-based, meaning-focused teaching practices into second language classrooms. And I count myself among those who's been very, very inspired by her work. She is the co-editor of Second Language Research and Practice, which we affectionately call SLURP. And this is the journal of the American Association of University Supervisors and Coordinators, AAUSC. And she's also served as the AAUSC president. She is the 2016 recipient of Wayne State University's Board of Governors Faculty Recognition Award for her co-authored book, A Multiliteracies Framework for Collegiate Foreign Language Teaching, which if you haven't read, strongly encourage. It's a really great introduction to this area, but also I come back to it all the time. I think it does a really rich job of exploring multiliteracies pedagogy, and it happens to be co-authored with our co-director, Beatrice Dupuis, so I should mention that. And then her most recent co-authored book, Literacies in Language Education, A Guide for Teachers and Teacher Educators, will be coming out with Georgetown University Press in spring 2023. So please keep your eyes open for the release dates. I kind of want to pre-order it myself. And so with that, I'm going to welcome Kate Paesani, and her webinar today will be focusing on using language forms to communicate about texts, a multiliteracies perspective. So please join me in welcoming Kate Paesani.
Thank you, Chantal. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Let me get my screen set up. So I am just so thrilled to be here. CERCLL is one of my favorite LRCs. I'm just going to say it. So I'm really excited to be here and to be kicking off this webinar series on Multiliteracies takes on language teaching. And I'm so excited to see all of you. One of my favorite things at CARLA when we do online talks is to see in the chat where everybody is from. And I can see that you're from all corners of the world and all corners of the United States. And I'm really grateful for your attendance today. So thank you. So I'm going to be, as Chantel said, talking about connections between language forms and target language text through a multiliteracies lens. So here's what we're going to cover today. We are going to talk about some key multiliteracies concepts to get you thinking about teaching language forms through target language texts. We're going to look at some strategies that will enhance students' communication around and through target language texts using language forms. We're going to look at some examples of texts and analyze their language features, and then see some sample lesson plans that feature those language features. And then I hope you'll come away with some tools that will allow you to apply what you've learned to creating text-based multiliteracies activities that focus on language forms. So to make this webinar engaging, I'll be using Mentimeter, and I'll have some QR codes up on the screen so that you can access that. We have a Zoom poll, and I'll also be asking you to put your ideas in the chat from time to time. So Chantel is going to help me navigate that. And I'll also stop at several points during the presentation to answer your questions. So please use the Q&A feature of the webinar to ask any questions you have. That makes it a little bit easier for us to manage the Q&A and tease your questions out from what's happening in the chat. So before I dive into a discussion of multiliteracies concepts related to the first objective that you see here, I just want to talk a little bit about myself and my journey with multiliteracies pedagogy and the instruction of language forms. So when I was a graduate student in the 1990s and I started teaching elementary French, I learned, like many of you probably, how to teach using a communicative approach. And I was encouraged to teach language forms meaningfully and inductively. And I loved doing this. Like, I loved creating little paragraphs that embedded the language forms that I was supposed to be teaching. And I was able to really tap into my love of French grammar. But when I started teaching at the intermediate level of the curriculum in my graduate program, and I was confronted with teaching authentic texts, in particular literature, I was baffled. I felt like my training in communicative language teaching wasn't getting me very far in doing the kind of textual analysis that was expected in the courses that I was teaching. And I wasn't able to see connections between these textual analysis activities on the one hand and the language forms that students were studying on the other hand. They felt like completely separate parts of the course for me. So when I took my first faculty job in 2000 as a language program director, I slowly started thinking and writing about ways to teach literary texts in particular while attending to students' language development through a focus on forms. And then in the mid-2000s, I read Rick Kern's book, Literacy and Language Teaching, for the first time. And through that, discovered Multiliteracies pedagogy. And I felt like I had found an approach that ticked all of the boxes for me. It provided a way to focus on form and meaning simultaneously, to prioritize working with target language texts, to increase student interest, to engage students critically with cultural products, practices, and perspectives, and selfishly to foster my own growth as a teacher scholar. It was really a transformative experience for me to read that book. And because of that experience, I've devoted my career over the past 15 years or so to teaching with and researching multiliteracies pedagogy. So that's how I come to you today. And I know that there are folks in the audience who are already familiar with multiliteracies pedagogy. I know there are folks in the audience who know me personally. So when you read the description of this webinar, you might have been surprised that I included a statement about the incompatibility of multiliteracies pedagogy and the instruction of language forms. Others of you may be here because you're curious or you agreed that maybe these two things might be incompatible. You have a healthy dose of skepticism about the relationship between these two things. Whatever your reason for being here today, I want to start our conversation by addressing this common misconception with you. So I want to start by hearing a little bit about what you are coming to this webinar with. I shared what I'm coming to the webinar with. So I'm going to be using Mentimeter a couple of times. You have a QR code here on the slide. And if you can't use the QR code, you can just use your device and go to menti.com and enter the code 88991460. And the question you're going to see is going to ask you about your opinions about the goals of a multiliteracies approach to language education. All right, so we'll just watch your responses live. So the goals of a multiliteracies approach to language education are meaning making, considering new practices and perspectives and interaction, enabling students to use resources that they already bring to the table, learning through texts, preparing learners to become better citizens through reading and writing, using language forms to make texts, another answer about meaning making. Yeah, lots of answers related to texts and meaning and sort of semiotic resources, including language. I see the word communication a lot in these responses. It's fine if you're not familiar. I'm going to do a crash course in multiliteracies pedagogy, so don't worry if you can't provide an answer. Immersing students in the language, that's a great way of thinking about engaging with multiliteracies pedagogy. Learning language through a rich context, so again, sort of thinking about texts. Yeah, recognizing what students bring to the table, recognizing the languages that they bring, the knowledge that they bring to the table in the classroom. Yeah, connecting to students' lived realities. Flexibility, that's a great word. Focusing on meaning over accuracy, bringing content and language together. Okay, great. So I'm going to move to the next question. So this is about your concerns. This is related to the misconceptions part of the description. So finish the sentence. I'm concerned about teaching grammar and vocabulary using a multiliteracies approach because. And I'll just say, as you're entering your responses, when I use the term language forms, I'm talking about grammar and vocabulary together, not just grammar. Okay, so students bring different things to the table that can make it challenging, right? They have different knowledge about the target language, and so that can make it hard to know what to target. We often teach language forms in a decontextualized way. Exams focus on language structure. So if you're teaching language forms through text, that may be counter to what you're doing in your exams. Some folks aren't concerned at all, so that's good to hear. It's harder to explain grammatical rules when you're working with texts. Students can get overwhelmed. Yeah, that's a really common concern. Finding the right text. It's very time intensive. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Students don't have enough language proficiency to be able to learn language forms through texts. Yeah, if we're prioritizing text, maybe that takes away from a focus on language forms. Students want to be taught grammar. Yeah. Okay, I lack practical examples. Well, hopefully today you'll leave with some practical examples. All right, thank you so much for your responses. I'm going to go ahead. I know everybody hasn't had a chance, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go back to the slide deck. Okay. So I want to look at some common misconceptions about the teaching of language forms using a multiliteracies approach. The list that I'm going to present is not exhaustive, but it's based on my experience working with teachers of various languages across K-16 contexts. And it's also based on published research, including research that I've been doing here at the University of Minnesota with my colleague Mandy Menke on teacher learning around multiliteracies pedagogy. So the first misconception is that working with text takes too much time away from learning language fundamentals. And this idea came out in some of your responses to the Menti poll. It's a common concern, not just about working with text, but also about addressing any kind of content that is not considered language related. What I hope you're going to come away with today is the idea that students can learn the fundamentals of language by working with target language texts and engaging in multiliteracies activities. So we'll do this by talking about the purpose of language forms in multiliteracies pedagogy, but I also want to point out that research suggests that working with text does not interfere with students' language development. A well-cited study by Hiram Maxim, for instance, showed that students who spent time working with texts, in addition to engaging in more communicatively oriented practice of language forms, fared just as well on language-focused exams as students who only spent time practicing language forms. The second misconception is that it's important to find the perfect text to teach the language forms in your curriculum. And this misconception is also related to time, which somebody pointed out in the Menti, because as I'm sure you've experienced, finding appropriate texts can be very challenging and time-consuming. And although I won't talk about text selection today, I'd like to invite you to consider that texts have much more to offer than simply practice of language forms in your chapter, meaning that you don't have to find a text that has 30 examples of the subjunctive for it to work in your class. Instead, I invite you to consider how students can use the language forms that they know or that they're learning to talk about the meaning of a text and how they can draw on their knowledge of the second language to learn new language forms that are present in a text. So finding the perfect text is less important than the types of activities you develop for working with those texts. The third misconception is that students need to know every vocabulary word to be able to interpret a text. And there are indeed studies of foreign language reading that show that students need to know about 80% of the vocabulary in a text to understand it. But if you look at research on reading development as a whole, this research shows that knowledge of the second language is only one factor that influences students' textual comprehension. Another factor called unexplained variance, a term that was used in the research of Elizabeth Bernhardt, actually has a larger impact on students' reading proficiency development. And this idea of unexplained variance relates to things like strategy use, students' level of engagement and interest, their knowledge of the subject, their motivation, and so on. The fourth misconception is that students don't develop communicative abilities when they interpret text. And when I say communicative abilities, I mean interpretive, presentational, and interpersonal communication. This misconception has been debunked by research on students' proficiency development in text-based curricula. There are numerous studies across multiple levels and languages showing that text-based approaches, including those grounded in multiliteracies pedagogy, foster not only students' interpretive communication, but also their oral and written interpersonal communication and their written presentational communication. And then a final misconception is that multiliteracies pedagogy doesn't help learners acquire language forms. And again, this research has been debunked, this misconception has been debunked by research into students' language acquisition as they work with texts. So some of you are probably familiar with or have heard about the literacies-based approach in the German program at Georgetown University. Their research shows, among other things, that working with texts fosters the acquisition of more complex sentence structures. And studies from other contexts have shown that working with texts can improve students' language awareness, increase their understanding and use of formal and informal registers, provide them with more language forms to draw on in presentational writing tasks, and allow them to see how language forms are used in context rather than just the mechanics of how they're formed. So our focus today is going to be moving beyond these misconceptions by identifying strategies and activities that can help you focus on teaching language forms by implementing multiliteracies activities that improve students' communicative abilities in two ways: using language forms to communicate about texts and using language forms to understand how a text communicates meaning. So to facilitate this work, I just want to build some conceptual understanding. I think this is especially important because there are some folks in the audience who don't have familiarity with multiliteracies pedagogy. So I want to start with a definition of foreign language literacies. So this comes from Rick Kern's book that I talked about at the start of the presentation. And even though this definition is 22 years old, it is really kind of the gold standard for defining foreign language literacies, and many scholars in this area continue to use this definition. I'm not going to read the definition, I'm just going to talk through the items in blue. So first and foremost, foreign language literacies is about creating and interpreting target language texts. And here I'm talking about texts in a very broad sense. So not just written language, but written, audio, audiovisual, visual, digital, or a combination of those modalities. So it really expands what we might consider to be a text. To be able to create and interpret meaning through text, it's important to understand how texts are constructed and how language works to create meaning within the text, how language relates to meaning, how it relates to the cultural context in which the text is situated, and to be able to think critically about those form, meaning, and sort of cultural connections in a text. Foreign language literacies is also dynamic, meaning that the way that we use language differs across individuals, communities, and societies. And then finally, foreign language literacies involves different types of knowledge and abilities. So it involves cognitive abilities like strategy use and problem solving. It involves knowledge of written and spoken language, because again, we're thinking about a very broad definition of literacy and text. So we're thinking it's not just limited to the written word. It involves foreign language literacies involves knowledge of genres and their various features, and it involves knowledge of culture, both one's first culture or cultures and one's second or third cultures. So when we break down this definition, we can see that it has three interrelated dimensions. It has a linguistic dimension, which is about the way that language works in the text to express meaning. It has a sociocultural dimension that is about sort of the situated nature of target language texts and how they reflect societies, individuals, and communities. And it has a cognitive dimension, which is really about the knowledge and abilities of the individual who is creating and interpreting texts. All three of these are necessary for developing students' foreign language literacies, although today our focus is really going to be on the linguistic dimension. So a second set of concepts critical to teaching language forms through a multiliteracies approach is related to the features that a target language text possesses. So textual features, or available designs in multiliteracies parlance, is the content of target language texts. And these are the different resources that we can draw on in the activities that we create for our students. So we can think about textual features as falling into three main buckets: language forms, conventions, and cultural content. So I'm going to talk about conventions and cultural content first and language forms last. So conventions are things like organizational features, genre features, things like, if you think about a genre like an infographic, there's always a relationship between images and text, and there's often bulleted lists or data presented, percentages presented in an infographic. So that's a particular feature of that genre. Conventions also include things like in an audiovisual text, like zooming in and zooming out, so camera effects, page layout, if you think about like a magazine cover, what that looks like. Those are all conventions. Cultural content is really about products, practices, and perspectives of the target cultures that you are studying. But it also is about background knowledge. What background knowledge do students bring to a text, and what background knowledge do they need to be able to interpret a text? And then moving up to language forms, so the focus of our webinar today, I mentioned that I'm talking today about grammar and vocabulary as language forms, but you can see from this list that language forms entail many different things. So of course, grammar and vocabulary, but also things like morphology, word order, the sound system of the language, the intonation patterns of the language, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more to language forms than just grammar and vocabulary. And of course, the specific textual features of any given text are going to depend on its modality, if it's written, audio, audiovisual, etc., and on its genre. So if it's a podcast, an infographic, a DIY video, a poem, all of those genres have different language forms, conventions, and cultural content that characterize them. Okay, so Chantel, this is a spot where I can stop and answer any questions. I saw there was one question in the chat about whether or not multiliteracies is only applied to foreign language teaching. And the answer to that question is no. In fact, the multiliteracies framework was developed in relation to first language literacy development. So, young learners kind of going through school and learning how to interact with texts, and sort of a response to the changing nature of texts and new technologies in the 20th and 21st century. And it's been applied to foreign language education since the end, like the 2000s. Like Rick Kern's book was really sort of the beginning of thinking about this approach in a foreign language context. All right, so again, I'll stop at various points during the presentation to entertain your questions. So please keep putting those in the Q&A box of your Zoom screen. Okay, so now that we have some conceptual knowledge to talk about language forms and about foreign language literacies, let's make things a little bit more concrete by considering two ways that language forms can facilitate communication in this approach. Okay, so the first purpose, just to kind of review, is using language forms to communicate about a text, drawing on what students know, what they bring to the text to scaffold their communication around the text. The second purpose is understanding how a text communicates. So here we're talking not about necessarily what students are bringing to the text, but rather the language forms that the text itself possesses that can serve as the content of interpretive communication activities. So for instance, if students are watching a DIY video that lays out the steps in a process, that video can serve to introduce students to the imperative form of verbs. And so that they can learn this verb form as they interpret and interrogate this text. A second example, if I go back to the fairy tale example that I gave earlier, fairy tales have a very clear chronology that often use transition words and temporal adverbs. So you can use those features of the fairy tale genre to introduce students to those vocabulary words, okay? So how do we facilitate this work? How do we engage students in activities that allow them to draw on what they already know to communicate about a text, or to draw on the features of the text to understand how it communicates meaning? We do it through 4 activity types that comprise multiliteracies pedagogy, and these are called knowledge processes. So I'm going to talk through each one of these, and then we're going to do a little Zoom poll. So the first knowledge process is called experiencing. In the work that we've been doing here at the University of Minnesota with my colleague, Mandy Minke, we found that having these little catchphrases or mantras, that's what you see in the first row here, help teachers kind of understand the essence of each knowledge process. So when students are experiencing, they explore familiar and new ideas. So this is really where students kind of jump in with both feet to interact with the text or ideas that are going to be in a text without a lot of critical reflection or analysis. And so this is where they can gain global comprehension of the text and also express their thoughts, opinions, and feelings. So an example would be a brainstorming activity where you give students the title of the text that they're going to be interacting with, and then they have to brainstorm vocabulary words. Another example would be true-false questions to get the gist of the text before doing more interpretive activities. The second knowledge process is conceptualizing, and this is where students connect language and meaning through text. So this is really where we zoom in and unpack a text by looking at its language forms, its conventions, its organizational features, and so on. So in conceptualizing activities, students are looking at these features of the text and thinking about how they connect to the way that what the text means. They're building knowledge and skills that they need to be able to communicate effectively and accurately. So an example might be a concept map. So let's say students are reading a text, a fairy tale that has 2 main themes. And then they have to go back to the text and find vocabulary words that relate to those themes and map out relationships among those words and between the two themes. Another example would be a synonym substitution, where students have a text where there are some unknown words and a teacher gives a list of known words and students have to find the equivalent in the text and then think about what impact it might have on the meaning of the text to use the synonym instead of the original word, for instance. You're always going back to the connection between the language form and the meaning of the text. In analyzing activities, students question the complexity of culture, language, and ideas. So whereas in conceptualizing activities, we're sort of zooming in on the details, in analyzing activities, we're zooming out to think about the broader context of what is learned through a text. So here students can relate meaning to different social, cultural, historical contexts and purposes. They can question what they've learned. They can question their own learning, like in a self-assessment. So an example would be a 3-2-1 summary, where students summarize a text in 3 sentences, make 2 cultural comparisons, and ask 1 remaining question. Kind of classic analyzing activity is a debate, where students have to take one side on an issue and then justify the side that they're taking. And then the fourth knowledge process is applying, and this is where students create texts and showcase new knowledge. So this is really where students take everything that they've learned through textual interpretation activities and then demonstrate that knowledge in some way. They're using language in new and creative ways. So an example would be a genre reformulation. So let's say students have read a poem and then they have to rewrite it as a descriptive essay, for instance. Or a poster presentation. Students take a topic that they've learned about as they've interpreted texts, they do research on it in more depth, and then they present a poster in their class. I want to point out that these knowledge processes are neither sequential nor hierarchical. And so what I mean by that is that you do not have to implement these activities in the order that you see on the slide. You'll commonly see that order, but really you can pick and choose which knowledge processes you want to use based upon your learning objectives and your students' needs. And when I say they're non-hierarchical, what I mean is that one isn't more important than the other. And in fact, what you want to strive for is kind of a balance across the different types of knowledge processes to ensure that you really are engaging students in textual interpretation and creation. Okay, so to test your understanding of the knowledge processes, we're going to do a Zoom poll, which will launch in just a second, but let me explain what the poll is going to ask you to do. So it's going to ask you to decide which knowledge process best describes different multiliteracies activities that we might implement in our classrooms. So for instance, if I were to ask you which knowledge process best characterizes a debate in which students argue different sides of an issue, you would choose analyzing. Now here's a hint. There's 4 activities in the Zoom poll. There's only one example of experiencing, one example of conceptualizing, one example of analyzing, and one example of applying. So if we could go ahead and launch the poll, we'll see where you are with your understanding. Okay, so we're at about 70% participation. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. If you didn't get a chance to respond, I'm sorry, but just for the interest of time, I think I'm just going to keep rolling here. So I'm going to end the poll, and then I'm going to share the results with you. The first one, text decoding to guess the meaning of a word. So this one was experiencing. I think that this can trip people up because I was emphasizing so much the connection between conceptualizing and language forms. And perhaps I should have front-loaded the poll by saying that each of the activities was going to focus on language forms in some way. So the reason that this is an experiencing activity is because students aren't doing any kind of reflection or analysis. They're guessing. So they're making their best effort at understanding meaning without having to go very deeply into the text. Okay. The second one, inductive reasoning to explain and analyze a language form based on its use, is analyzing. So way to go, attendees. The majority chose analyzing. The key word in here is analyze. right? But the reason that this is analyzing is because they're not just looking at one or two instances of a form and trying to connect it. They're sort of, it's a big picture. So imagine students were doing this in relation to the use of the imperative, the imperfect and the preterite in a text. That really requires you to think about the text as a whole and to make some generalizations, to do some summarizing. All of these kind of are linked to the knowledge process of analyzing. Okay, the next one, story retelling to relate a story from a different character's perspective, which would involve changing, for instance, the first from first person to the third person or something like that. That is an applying activity. So that allows students to showcase their new knowledge. And then finally, text annotations to identify features and discuss their meaning. This is a conceptualizing activity. I recognize that the difference between the conceptualizing and analyzing activities in this poll is very subtle, but this is conceptualizing because we're looking at specific words in the text. We're doing this sort of zooming in as opposed to getting a big picture view of the way language is working in the text. Okay, so I will pause now and take any questions that have come up.
Yeah, there's a couple that are more about examples of the different knowledge processes, but I'm going to start with one that is, what levels could you start teaching with a multi-literacies approach?
Oh yeah, so very start of language instruction. I have to admit that I have not taught a first semester language class in a very long time, but here at the University of Minnesota, for instance, our lower level language program is organized using both multiliteracies and communicative language teaching approaches. And so from the very first semester, students are, I'm talking about the French program here, I don't know if I said that. Students are using multiliteracies pedagogy, or the teachers are using multiliteracies pedagogy to engage their students with target language texts.
I thought that was a good one to get out there. And there's a couple of questions that are just about sort of some of the examples. So one was about if you could give an example of a text matrix, and I went ahead and I put a link in there to CORL's resource with Janet Swaffer speaking, but I think you might have other examples as well.
Yeah, so a text matrix is actually something that can fall under both experiencing and conceptualizing. I put it under conceptualizing, well, I don't know, I just because I did. So a text matrix is basically a way to organize students' understanding of a text. So typically it includes two parts. The first part is filling out information about their understanding of the text. So often it's identifying the who, what, where, when of the text. And then the second part is going back to the text and pulling out language samples that support students' understanding of the who, what, where, and when of the text. And so the reason that I'm saying that this is a conceptualizing activity is because they're connecting their understanding to the language forms that are in the text that sort of show that understanding. So they could pull out a vocabulary word or an entire sentence to support their answer to the who, what, where, when of the text.
I think that brings up a really helpful point there too, that these are not absolute categories, right? That there might be some overlap, but it's really about what is the focus of that activity in some ways.
100%. And thinking about what are students doing while they're engaging in this knowledge process. So that's why I find these catchphrases or mantras to be really helpful, because it sort of takes you back to the essence of each one and what students are doing when they're engaging in those activities.
And then maybe we'll take one more for now, because I'm going to save a couple of these, I think, for a little later in the discussion. But about the genre reformulation, does it have in what ways are you kind of focusing in on certain aspects or certain features of the text when you're thinking about that kind of activity?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the activities that lead up to applying are the ones that are going to hone in on the features of the text. So let's take that example of a student's rewrite a poem as a descriptive text. And let's assume that they're already familiar with writing a descriptive text. Okay, so the activities leading up to that would be focused on analyzing the poem itself. So getting a general understanding of that poem, understanding maybe the rhyme structure, or the themes that are in there and how those themes relate to some sort of broader sociocultural context. It could be the conceptualizing activities could maybe focus on certain vocabulary words in the poem. And then when students do the genre reformulation, they can draw on those vocabulary words, for instance, and include them in that descriptive text that they write. So in that way, the poem could actually serve as a scaffold for doing the reformulation, both in terms of its meaning and in terms of its language forms.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions that are a little broader, so I'm just going to have us come back to those later. But do know I'm keeping track of your questions, everybody. I'm not skipping them.
Okay, thanks everybody for your questions. They're really great. Okay, so we've got this sort of conceptual background. We've talked about the two different purposes of language forms in a multiliteracies approach. So now I want to look at some examples of how the knowledge processes can help us design multiliteracies lessons that encourage students to communicate about a text using language forms that they already know, and to understand how a text communicates through the language forms within it. So first is a lesson that helps students communicate about a text where language forms they already know are used to scaffold interpretive communication activities. And I'm using English language text for this. So this is a grumpy cat meme. I love this meme. I am not a morning person, so I'm very grateful to be presenting later in the day. So what I would like from you is in the chat to respond to the question in the slide. What language forms will help students communicate about this text? This question is not asking you to think about the language forms in the text, but rather the language forms that students will bring to the text to help them talk about it. So what might be some language forms that novice learners of English or maybe intermediate learners of English might need to talk about this grumpy cat meme? And you can just go ahead and answer in the chat any ideas that come to your mind.
I've definitely already seen a couple people say adjectives.
Mm-hmm.
Vocabulary, more specifically vocabulary for emotions and description, salutations, traits, reflexive verbs, questions, common habits. So the concept of being not a morning person, I think in some ways. Descriptive words. The idiom morning person. Adjectives, greetings, things like word order.
Great. Okay, thanks everybody. You actually came up with a lot more ideas than I did, so I appreciate that. So I thought that, of course, greeting and leave-taking vocabulary are essential to being able to talk about this text. I also thought that chunks or sentence starters like I like or I don't like or there is, there are to be able to describe the text. Adjectives, you mentioned adjectives, personality traits, you mentioned that as well. But you can see that there are multiple ways that we could approach this text and draw on what students already know. Okay, so let's look at a lesson plan that uses language forms to help students talk about this text. This lesson is going to focus on greeting and leave-taking vocabulary and chunks or sentence starters. So the learning objectives for this lesson are that students will be able to describe their preferences about the morning, explain and use greeting and leave-taking vocabulary, and analyze the humor of memes. So the first activity they do is an experiencing activity, and I've tried to bold the parts of the activities that focus on language forms. So the first thing that they do is brainstorm words that they associate with morning and give one reason why they are or are not a morning person. So they could say things like sunshine, coffee, crossword puzzles, and this is my image of morning. And then they use the phrases I like or I don't like to express whether they're a morning person. So those sentence starters. Then the teacher projects the meme without the words. So just the image of Grumpy Cat, and asks the class if Grumpy Cat is a morning person. Okay. Then in a conceptualizing activity, the instructor says good morning, and the students provide appropriate responses based upon what they already know. Then the teacher projects the meme with the words and reads it and discuss the response, no such thing, to the phrase good morning. And the teacher asks, is this an appropriate response? Is this something that was presented in your textbook as a response to good morning? And then finally, students identify language and visual features showing that Grumpy Cat doesn't like mornings. So, you know, the quotes and the question mark and the no such thing, the frown, The fact that Grumpy Cat is leaning against a pillow, probably still in bed, right? And that the whole color scheme is gray. Like all of these things contribute to that. Then in an analyzing activity, students discuss the intent of the meme. So what was the author trying to convey? Why is this humorous? Who might be the audience for this? And if you have lower level learners, the teacher could even provide a list of options to each of these questions so that students can stay in the target language. And then finally, in an applying activity, you're probably going to guess what this was going to be, students create their own Grumpy Cat meme. So they use the same picture and they have to take a different greeting or leave-taking expression that they know, and they have to create a meme. And then the class votes on the funniest meme based upon the features that make it funny that they had identified in their previous activities. Okay. So this is an activity that draws on what students already know, helps scaffold the lesson, helps them communicate about the text. Now let's look at an example of how the knowledge processes can help students understand how a text communicates by treating the language forms that are in the text as the content of the lesson. So the text that you have on the slide here, I'm just going to talk about it for a minute. This comes from a journalistic essay from the New York Times called The American Dream, and it features individuals, families, groups who each talk about what their American dream is. Some of them are immigrants, some of them are not. This person, CERCLL, is not an immigrant. And so each of the featured individuals or groups, the way it's presented is the same format that you see on the slide. So there's a title with the person's name and where they are from. There's an image of the person. There's a handwritten and typed version of their American dream statement, and then there's a caption next to the photo. Now, I know this is really small print, so I'm going to read the text to you. But as I do this, I'd like you to think about what language forms the text possesses that are important for understanding its meaning. So this time, instead of considering what language forms students are bringing to the text, think about the language forms that the text itself possesses that students can learn. So you can enter that in the chat and I'll go ahead and read. So here's the dream statement. My dream is to never stop growing, changing, or becoming. My transition from female to male was only the beginning. I want to feel whole in my skin and loved alongside others whom I love. I ask a whole lot of questions. My dream is to be okay without knowing all of the answers. And then Skylar's name is under the statement. And the caption next to Skylar's photo reads, Skylar CERCLL, 25, was born Catherine Elizabeth, but by the age of 3, wanted to be called Mike. At 15, he entered gender therapy and began taking testosterone. So again, in the chat, what language forms does the text possess that are important for understanding its meaning?
So far I've seen, so gerunds, repetitive use of gerunds, possessive adjectives, for example, the repetition of the word my, noun forms, gerunds, the ing forms. Yeah, so people are noticing that as being salient.
What about vocabulary?
Possessive adjectives, multiple verb structures, quantifiers, things like a whole lot, all of. That's interesting. So the present tense, gerunds. Yeah, a lot of people are noticing these, these ing verbs in the work they're doing.
Yeah, okay. So some of the things that jump out to me in this text are the use of infinitival clauses. So my dream is plus infinitive, I want plus infinitive. Vocabulary related to sort of personal growth and self-acceptance. Vocabulary to refer to trans people. Pronouns, I think some of you mentioned pronouns, and possessive adjectives relatedly. Numbers, I mean, there's just a few numbers in here, but gerunds definitely a very salient feature of this text. So I'm gonna, in the lesson that I'm going to show you, I'm going to go to the lesson for this. The focus is only on infinitival clauses and then also some of the organizational features of this piece. So the photo, the caption, and the American dream statement and how those are all related to one another. So in this lesson, the objectives are that students will be able to define key features of the American dream, express their own American dream and its motivation, and then discuss relationships between text, caption, and images in this American Dream journalistic essay. Okay, so in the first activity, students are analyzing. So remember I mentioned that multiliteracies pedagogy isn't sequential. So here we're starting with analyzing instead of experiencing. So the teacher introduces the article from the New York Times and briefly overviews the article, just like I did with you. And then this is the analyzing part. Students identify the attended audience and predict the content of what they're going to read and the tone of what they're going to read. Then in an experiencing activity, students read the CERCLL entry, the one that you just saw. And as a whole class, they identify the who, what, where, and when of the text. Okay. So they're sort of getting general comprehension of the text during this experiencing activity. Then in small groups, they look at the genre features essentially, or the conventions of the text. They identify the different components. So the author's name, where he lives, his dream statement, the motivation for his dream, his photo, etc. And they decide what each component of the text contributes to its meaning and why it's needed, right? Then in another conceptualizing activity, this one is focused on infinitival clauses, the teacher projects Skylar's dream statement, so the one that you read, and introduces the infinitival clause construction. So students are learning this language form through this text. Then students go back to the other dream statements in the whole article, underline all the dream statements, and as a class, they identify what language forms are used to express a dream statement in addition to an infinitival clause construction. And they create a master list on the board. And then finally, in an applying activity, students reflect on their own dreams for the future and create their own American Dream text that includes the components that they identified in activity number 3 and uses 2 different language forms used to express a dream statement identified in number 4. Okay. So in these 2 lessons, we saw different types of language-focused activities that encourage communication about and through texts and that reflect the knowledge processes of multiliteracies pedagogy. So these included brainstorming vocabulary, using sentence starters to express an opinion, identifying essential text components and connecting them to the overall message of the text, identifying language forms used to express an American dream, and using those language forms to create a new text. So I'm going to stop here since we've talked about 2 examples and see if there are any more questions.
We have quite a few.
Okay.
I'm actually going to start with one that I think was just inspired by what you were just talking about, which is about the order between these. Does it matter whether analyzing comes before or after experiencing, or how flexible are these steps?
Yeah, they're very flexible. So it really just depends on how you want to engage student with the text, what your goals are for the lesson. So that I intentionally provided examples where you saw things go in that sort of experiencing, conceptualizing, analyzing, applying order, and then something that didn't respect that order to show you this flexibility. I can say, however, that typically experiencing activities provide scaffolding for the other knowledge processes. So often in a lesson, you'll see multiple experiencing activities that lead to analyzing or applying, for instance, because those are less cognitively demanding for students and they build their basic understanding of the text that then supports their ability to do more interpretive and analytical work.
That's such a helpful framing. We've had a couple of different questions that are around the question of levels. So how do you engage with different levels, and then people wondering the kinds of examples that you're showing here, if you have levels in mind where you would use an active or where you would use a lesson like this with text similar to this.
Yeah, so the first example with the grumpy cat, let me see if I can get back to that one. So with this example, so this was co-written with my colleague Mandy Mankey. We wrote this really for novice learners of English. And that's why actually in the analyzing activity, we suggest that you could provide a list of of options for answering these questions, because when students are at the novice level, they don't have the linguistic proficiency to do analyzing in the target language. They just can't express complex ideas. So you can, if you want to stay in the target language, if that's really important to you for analyzing activities, then you can do this kind of multiple choice thing or ask for one-word answers or something like that. The other option is to do these activities in English. I know some people might be gasping at that suggestion. I've actually said that before to live audiences, and there have been audible gasps in the room. But I think, you know, if you're really trying to adhere to the 90% recommendation for target language use, analyzing activities are a place where you can use your 10% English. Like it's just, that's a really pedagogically sound use of English, so that you really are pushing learners to do these interpretive activities. So yeah, so this one's for novice learners, and then this one is more for intermediate. That was our target with this one. So, you know, the work they're doing is a little bit more complex. They're asked to do a lot more writing in this. They have to do a lot more grammatical analysis in this. And so this is more appropriate for learners that have a little bit higher level of proficiency.
Great. And I've got one more I think I'm going to thread in now, and then I promise we'll come back to the other ones later on. But could you explain the difference or maybe the relationship between multiliteracy and multimodal materials?
I'm just trying to think about how to answer that question. So for me, when I think about multimodality, I think that that's a way of characterizing texts and ways of communicating. So if we think about, for instance, an Instagram post, that's a multimodal post because it includes image and or video, it includes text, it can include hyperlink. So that has multiple modalities. Multiliteracies for me is really a framework for thinking about students' foreign language literacies development and an associated pedagogy for putting that into practice. Chantel's nodding her head, so I think I did okay. That was a hard one.
I think that's great. There's a couple of others that I think are a little broader that you might touch upon later, so I'll come back to those in the next break.
Okay, perfect. That sounds good. All right, so I have one more sort of segment to the webinar. And so what I want to talk about now is ways that we can rethink some of the common activities that we do to teach language forms to make them more multiliteracies leaning, if you will, more reflective of multiliteracies concepts. So before I give some examples, I'd like to hear from you. I'm curious to know what kinds of activities you use to engage students with language forms. So these can be activities that you use when you're teaching a target language text, or it can be activities that you use when you're doing a grammar or a vocabulary lesson. And it can be anything. It doesn't matter. It could be just repetition. That's fine. I'm just curious to know what kinds of things that you are doing in your classes to engage students with language forms. And you can just enter that in the chat.
See, Kahoot, which my teenagers would strongly support. Jeopardy, changing story endings, role play activities, specifically for the lower levels, reading and underlining certain structures, bingo games, assessing using quiz, identifying unit vocabulary, learning apps, mind maps. Jamboars, I don't know that one. Information gap activity, Jamboars?
Oh, Jamboard, yeah.
Oh, Jamboards must be, okay, yeah, got it now. Yeah, a couple more for that. Writing sentences, crossword puzzles, working with dictionaries, listening to dialogues, creating poems, working with YouTube videos, Quizlet.
Okay, so a lot of variety and a lot of, it's interesting, there are activities that are really focused on form, and there are activities that are really focused on meaning, and then there's some crossover between the two. So some of the things that you mentioned are the ones that I'm going to talk about, and the first one is underlining language forms in a text. So I want to talk about how we can take some of these common language forms activities that we've had in our toolkit forever, and just tweak them slightly to make them more multiliteracies oriented. So I'm sure we've all done activities, or our textbooks encourage students to do activities where they underline language forms in a text, and then that's the end. The activity is over. So if you wanted to make this more multiliteracies, you could have them underline language forms in a text and then explain why these words are important or what their meaning is in the text. So underline all the adverbs. Okay, why are so many adverbs used in the text? And students can say, oh, to advance a chronology. And there you have a multiliteracies activity. That's a conceptualizing activity, right? Another example that we see a lot is guessing the meaning of a word from context. It was in the poll that we just did, right? So to make this more multiliteracies, let's say you've given students 5 words, or your textbook has given students a list of words in the text that they're supposed to give the English equivalent of. Well, they could do that and then explain why these 5 words are essential to being able to understand the text, or how they relate to the main theme of the text. Another example, I gave the example of the synonym substitution activity earlier. So you could provide students with synonyms and then they have to match them and decide which word is more appropriate, the original word or the synonym that they provided. Another really common language forms activity is transform the sentence. So what I mean by this is, students have maybe just learned the preterite and you say, I go to the store. In the past, and you wait for them to say, went to the store, right? This was one of the techniques that I was taught when I learned how to teach. So instead of doing that, if you want to do that in relation to a text, you could have them change the verb tense or aspect and then talk about how that change impacts the meaning of the text. So let's say you have a text that's written in the preterite and the students change the verb to the imperfect. Well, that's a huge change in meaning. And so they can talk about that and why the preterite might have been more appropriate than the imperfect and stuff like that. Another really common language form activity when we work with text is before students read a text, we give them a vocabulary list and its English equivalent. These activities can be helpful, except that once words are in context, their meaning can be quite different from the one-word definition that we might provide. So instead, one thing that we might do is provide a vocabulary list and then have students organize them thematically or create some kind of a concept map. So in this way, instead of relying on their knowledge of English to be able to understand those words, they're really thinking about themes that are going to show up in the text and how those words relate to the themes. And then a final activity is repeating verb paradigms. If we've all done this. If you're a French teacher, you probably have used the boot, where you have all those forms that are pronounced, there's 4 forms that are pronounced the same way. You do a little boot, and you do your pronunciation activities. So obviously we can't really do this with a text, but one way that we can sort of transform this sort of activity is to have students identify the different conjugations that they see in a text and identify trends. So certain genres are going to use different, first person versus third person more or less frequently. And so sort of underlining those conjugations can help students understand why those forms are important for a particular genre, for instance. So important takeaways from this: you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can make minor tweaks to the activities that you were already doing to make them more reflective of multiliteracies concepts. And then to make an activity more multiliteracies oriented, you really need to move beyond just focusing on form, but also focusing on the meanings that those forms express within the text, right? That's a kind of a key multiliteracies concept, is this form-meaning connection. So as you continue to think about ways to teach language forms through multiliteracies pedagogy, you can ask yourself some questions, and these questions are reflective of the way that I've organized today's webinar. So you can ask yourself, what language forms have students learned up to this point that will help them interpret this text? So what are they bringing to the text that can help them communicate about what they're learning? What language forms does the text possess that are important for understanding its meaning? So going back to that text analysis activity that we did. So doing your own text analysis before you even start thinking about how you're going to design activities is going to help you respond to the second question, which is then how do these forms in the text relate to what I'm actually teaching, right? To the themes that I'm teaching in my chapter or my curriculum. And then finally, you can ask yourself, what multiliteracies activities can I use to focus on language forms while teaching this text? Should I be doing experiencing activity, conceptualizing, analyzing, applying? And how can I tweak the activities that I already use to make them more in line with multiliteracies pedagogy? And as you saw, you can just make really small adjustments and you're there. So you really don't have to start from scratch. Okay, so before I conclude, I have one more slide. I want to hear from you one more time. And I'd like to know how what we discussed today will impact the way that you teach language forms. So this is a second Menti poll. You'll have to scan the new QR code or go to menti.com and enter the code 64003822. And I'm thinking that Kate is probably going to put that in the chat. And so since that is in the chat, I'll just wait a second and then I'll switch screens. I'll give people a chance to scan the code. Okay, so again, what is one idea from today's webinar that you will apply to the teaching of language forms from a multiliteracies perspective? I love this, the way to revive grammar. That's awesome. Okay, ask why. I love that. Yeah, so, not just, okay, here are these language forms in the text, but why are they there? Why did the author choose them? Why do they help me understand the text, right? Oh, and I love this one. I'm surprised about how many of these strategies I already use. So yeah, I was hoping that would be a takeaway for you, that you don't have to start from scratch. You can do multiliteracies pedagogy by drawing on the toolkit that you already possess. Okay, yeah, so student input, thinking about the knowledge processes, looking at a text and what it has to offer, focusing more on meaning. Yeah, I think that's really hard for us. Like depending on how we've been socialized into the profession, we didn't learn to think about connections between form and meaning necessarily, or to look at language forms in context through text. It's really hard to do. It's the area where teachers struggle the most. If you read the research on teacher learning around multiliteracies pedagogy, that is the hardest thing for teachers to be able to do.
Kate, real quick, I think we had a mix up with the code. So I'm seeing it's 1111 or 11071142. So if you use the code that's at the top of what,
oh dear,
what Kate's
I'm
doing
so
right
sorry.
now, that's okay. I think a lot of people are getting it, but just for
okay,
missed it.
Thank you everybody for your flexibility. I appreciate it. I've been having all kinds of tech snafus today. Okay, yeah. So some stuff here on applying and being creative with language. Going to the text, thinking about what the text has to offer, and thinking about text differently. Just a picture or a social media post can be a really rich text for you to use with your students. Okay, great. I'm sorry for the tech snafu. I'm going to go to my last slide so that we still have time to do some more Q&A because I see it's 20 past now. But I really appreciate your feedback. Okay, so just some concluding thoughts. I hope that I have shown today that the multiliteracies pedagogy and the teaching of language forms are compatible. So this idea of incompatibility was really just kind of a way to bait you in to come attend the webinar. Language forms can help students communicate about a text and also understand how a text communicates meaning. So these sort of dual purposes of language forms from a multiliteracies perspective. The knowledge processes provide you with different options for acquiring, interpreting, and using language forms. So the knowledge processes, again, are experiencing, conceptualizing, analyzing, and applying. And again, I know I've said this several times, but there's no need to start from scratch. I know that adopting new teaching paradigms can be intimidating. And I also know that the multiliteracies approach can feel abstract. So, use what you already have and make small adjustments and experiment and see how it goes. But you really can move in this direction based on what you're already doing. So that concludes everything that I have to present. I do want to mention that many of the ideas and the activities that I presented today come from two co-authored books. The first is one that Chantel mentioned. Actually, she mentioned both in the introduction. But a multiliteracies framework for collegiate foreign language teaching actually grew out of a CERCLL project called Percolate. And that book is published by Pearson. It's from 2016. And then she also mentioned literacies and language education. This is a book that grew out of the literacies and language education project that we're doing at CARLA, and you have the website there on the slide. And this will be coming out in, we think, March or April of 2023 from Georgetown University Press. So thank you. I'm eager to hear more questions, Chantel. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So first of all, I'm seeing lots of praise, which I will share in, but we do have some questions. Maybe the first one I'll take is, again, about the pedagogical acts. Do you recommend using all of the pedagogical acts in every class and working with every single text, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, so just for those of you who don't know that terminology, pedagogical acts is kind of a synonym for knowledge processes. So yeah, that's a great question. We get that question a lot in the professional development that we do around multiliteracies pedagogy. I mean, the answer is kind of yes and no. So I think across a unit where you're doing work with texts, you want to make sure you're hitting on every knowledge process. But you certainly can't have an applying activity in every lesson because it's going to take up way too much class time. So you want to kind of think about how that's going to get spread out over the course of a week or, you know, several weeks of an instructional unit. But what I would say is that don't forget to do all the knowledge processes at some point, because if you only do experiencing and then maybe only do applying, you're leaving out these essential components of the pedagogy that really engage students in interpretation and analysis and get at language forms in the text. So it's kind of a vague answer, but yeah.
No, I think that gets at it. A question that, I mean, is similarly related in that it's also about the place of this in curriculum is, how do you connect the things that you're talking about to assessment?
Oh, yeah. The assessment, that's like the bane of everybody's existence, right? So, you know, assessment is really tricky because there aren't good examples of multiliteracies assessments out there. And I think we also feel like when we're doing assessment, we have to measure students' accuracy. So, you know, I would say that when you're thinking about assessment, you want to think about, like, what is your overarching goal? If you really want to develop students' foreign language literacies in your assessments, then you need to engage them in the kinds of activities that I demonstrated today. So even your assessments can include, like, if I'm talking about a traditional test, for instance, can include experiencing, conceptualizing, analyzing, and applying activities. The other thing is that applying is often considered to be sort of a summative assessment activity type. So when you're having students do writing assignments, or they're creating videos, or they're doing a portfolio or whatever, those kinds of multiliteracies applying activities serve as an assessment where you can also measure students' language use.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to think about the assessment itself as connecting to these knowledge processes and not being separate from it. There were a couple of questions I find really interesting about multilingualism. So you talked about using the L1 in the classroom. What about translation or other languages from family or from other learning experiences?
Yeah, so it's interesting that this question came up because I just had come through my Google Scholar alerts. There's a new article in either TESOL Journal or TESOL Quarterly that's talking about intersections between translanguaging pedagogy and multiliteracies pedagogy. So if you don't know what translanguaging pedagogy is, it's really an approach that draws on all of the linguistic resources that multilingual students bring to a class. So this is really relevant for ESL instruction in the United States, but it's becoming more and more of interest to folks who do world language instruction as well. So I kind of feel like you got to draw on what students are bringing to the class, because that's going to enrich the experience. And if it's going to help them go deeper into a text, then why not? That's a very general answer, because it's really not my area of expertise. And I think there's been very little done in world language education related to translanguaging pedagogy. But I think that that's going to change pretty quickly. It's such a hot topic right now.
I'm going to go look for that article as soon as we're done with this webinar.
Yeah.
I think that's helpful in itself, is framing it in terms of it's part of that larger repertoire that people are expanding through these available designs.
Yeah, exactly.
I have two questions that I save for the end, not because I think they're less interesting or important, but because one of them is about connecting multiliteracies to digital tools. And I know that one of the webinars we have coming up at the end by Elise Petit will focus on digital storytelling. And then a question about how we approach genre. So does either of those sound immediately like one you'd more like to answer? Because we also have Bruna Sommerferius presenting about genre in multiliteracies pedagogy coming up. So this is my reminder to you all that this is the start of a conversation through this webinar series, and that we can't do everything in an hour and a half. But maybe starting with digital tools, are there any?
Sure, throw it at me and let's see if I can manage the question. It's a little outside of my expertise, but that's okay.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite digital tools that you've worked with in any multiliteracies pedagogies?
Oh, gosh, after a year of teaching remotely, I've almost sort of rejected digital tools because I disliked doing that so much. But I think what I like to do is, for me, the digital tools come into play in terms of text selection. So I've been trying to do more with social media with students, and encouraging them to use things like TikTok and Instagram to be able to expand their knowledge about topics. Because that's the kind of thing that gets them excited. And I think nobody, there aren't that many people that are asking them to do that. I mean, I'm in French, so it's a pretty traditional discipline. So, that's one thing. I really like Mentimeter, as you can see today. And so I like to do things like word clouds to kind of understand students' thinking, but I don't know if that's particularly multiliteracies. I've also dabbled a little bit with digital social reading tools. I've worked with Hypothesis a little bit, but I think it's great, but the interface with our Canvas was really bad. And so I didn't have a good experience with it. So yeah. The one that I really like, what's it called? It's not Hypothesis. It's anyway, there's another digital social reading tool that's really good, but our university doesn't support it, so I'm not allowed to use it.
Oliver suggesting Perusal, which we just—
Yes, that's the one. It's like really good. Yeah, that one's really good.
Strong recommend. I think I'll bring in just one more here, and I'm actually going to weave two questions together, because there were a couple questions where people were trying to think through how this approach relates to things like focus on form or focus on forms, and this idea of kind of the teacher guiding the students through. So maybe I'll just use that as an opportunity for you to kind of summarize multiliteracies approaches as this, where do you see the focus on forms, or how does it relate to that kind of thinking in pedagogy?
It sort of gets back to what I was talking about today. I think one thing that we can think about with target language, working with target language texts, is that they're a way of sort of providing an inductive presentation of new material, new grammatical and lexical material. So that's kind of a way to focus on form. And we know that students are going to learn grammar better if we're focusing on meaning first. Like, there's tons of research that supports that. And so I think a multiliteracies approach is very compatible with that SLA research. So sort of using the text as a springboard to introduce grammatical forms is one way to think about things. And then another is to think about, using target language text to go deeper into students' knowledge of particular grammatical forms, so that they can not just, oh, look, here's an example of the preterite in context, but rather really interrogate the use of the preterite in this textual context, in a way that they might not do if they were just doing more sort of communicative activities. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but
I think you are. And I think in some ways it brings it back to the nice comment we had in the Mentimeter at one point, that this is in some ways about reviving, but also rethinking grammar and the role that it plays in our pedagogies, and how it connects to other things like multimodality, which a couple of people were excited in talking about more. I feel like we could keep talking, but it's been an hour and a half, and so I want to make sure to respect everybody's time. Please do carry on the conversation by attending some of the other webinars in our series. We'll be diving in on a couple of the things that came up, and I'm just grateful for this really wonderful introduction to the series and for your time, Kate. So please join me. I'll be the only one who can clap aloud, but please join me in thanking Kate Paesani for this wonderful webinar today.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Hopefully I'll see some of you at ACTFL. And if you come to the LRC booth, we can share some literacies resources from both CERCLL and CARLA.
Oh, that's a great plug. Yes, if you're going to be at ACTFL, but definitely come by the booths. And we'll make sure that all of your comments and your thank yous and your praise that are popping up there really rapidly, that chat thread gets to Kate as well. And thanks everybody for spending
I can see it
your time with us. Yeah.
Thanks everybody. I'm feeling the love. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
People had such great questions. I tried to get
they were good. Yeah. Do you guys always get folks from like many different corners of the world? Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it helps because it brings in a lot of different perspectives as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, man, I love that at the CARLA talks. All right, good. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And we'll be in touch. Yeah. Okay.
Bye. Thanks.